I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and stayed patient long enough, my parents would eventually see me the way they saw my sister. I thought approval was something you could earn, like good grades or a promotion. I didn't realize until much later that sometimes, in some families, approval is already assigned before you're even old enough to speak. My sister Clara was 3 years older than me, and from the very beginning she shone in a way that made people squint. She was beautiful in that effortless, symmetrical way. Straight teeth, glossy hair, the kind of smile that made teachers soften their voices. My mother used to dress her like a porcelain doll, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her bows like she was presenting something delicate to the world. I was different, taller, quieter, awkward in my own skin for years. I liked books more than people. I liked drawing floor plans of houses I would never live in. I liked imagining spaces where everything had a purpose and nothing felt misplaced. My father would look at Clara's report cards and clap her on the back. "That's my girl," he'd say proudly. When mine came, he'd nod once and say, "Not bad." Not bad. That phrase followed me like a shadow. The comparisons started early. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" my mother would sigh when I forgot to brush my hair. "Clara never talks back. Clara keeps her room spotless. Clara has ambition." I had ambition, it just didn't look like theirs. When Clara got into a prestigious university on a partial scholarship, my parents threw a party. They invited neighbors, distant cousins, even the mailman who barely knew us. My father raised a glass and said, "This is what hard work looks like." I was 16, standing in the corner, holding a paper plate of cake, wondering what my hard work looked like to them. Clara studied business. She learned the language my father respected: numbers, investments, returns. She dated men who wore watches that cost more than our monthly groceries. When she married Ethan, a real estate developer with an easy laugh and family money, my parents acted like they'd personally closed the deal. The wedding was extravagant, white roses everywhere, a venue with chandeliers so bright they hurt my eyes. My mother cried the entire ceremony, whispering, "She did it! She really did it!" Did what? I wondered. Married well? Won something invisible? By then, I was 23, working 2 jobs while finishing my degree in architecture. Not glamorous architecture. I wasn't designing skyscrapers in New York. I was drafting small community projects and doing freelance work at night. I lived in a tiny, rented apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like it was coughing up secrets. The first time my parents laughed at me about it was at Thanksgiving. We were sitting around Clara's massive dining table. Everything smelled like roasted garlic and polished wood. My father was admiring the crown molding. My mother ran her fingers over the marble island like she was parading a prized animal. I made an offhand comment about one day designing my own home. My father chuckled. "With what money?" Clara smiled, not cruelly, just amused. "You're still renting, right?" I nodded. My mother leaned back in her chair and said it lightly, almost playfully. "Sweetheart, you'll never have a house like your sister." The table went quiet for a second. Then someone changed the subject. But I heard it, I felt it, like a stamp pressed on my skin. "You'll never." After that, it became a joke, a recurring punchline. When I mentioned working overtime, my father would say, "Saving up for that mansion?" and laugh. When Clara renovated her kitchen again, my mother sent me photos with captions like, "This is what success looks like." And every now and then, usually when I dared to sound hopeful about my future, one of them would repeat it. "You'll never have a house like your sister." At first, I tried to argue. I'd explain that architecture wasn't about quick money, that I was building experience, that I wanted to design something meaningful. My words floated in the air and dissolved. Eventually, I stopped defending myself. I just worked. I worked through weekends, I worked through heartbreaks, I worked until my hands cramped and my eyes burned. I took on projects other architects didn't want, small budgets, tight deadlines, clients who changed their minds every week. I learned how to stretch a dollar without making it look stretched. And slowly, quietly, things began to shift. I met Daniel at a job site. He was a contractor with calloused hands and steady eyes. He didn't talk much at first, but when he did, it was thoughtful. He respected blueprints. He respected precision. He respected me. The first time I showed him one of my personal designs, a modest, modern home with clean lines and wide windows, he didn't laugh. He traced the drawing with his finger and said, "This feels like you." No one had ever said that about anything I created. We started dating 6 months later. There were no chandeliers, no extravagant venues, just coffee and chipped mugs and long conversations about foundation materials and future dreams. One night, sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment because I still couldn't afford a proper couch, I told Daniel about my parents' joke. He frowned. "That's not funny." I said, "It's fine. They don't mean it." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of house would you build if no one was watching?" The question settled into me like a seed. What kind of house would I build if it wasn't about proving something, if it wasn't about granite countertops or wraparound porches? I closed my eyes and described it. Large windows for natural light, a kitchen that felt warm instead of cold and glossy, shelves built into the walls for books, a small garden in the back, not for show, but for mornings with coffee. Daniel listened like it mattered, and for the first time in my life, the house I imagined didn't feel like a comparison. It felt like a promise. Meanwhile, Clara and Ethan's life looked perfect from the outside. Bigger renovations, new cars, exotic vacations. My parents praised every upgrade like it was a personal victory. "Now that's a real home," my father said once, scrolling through photos. I said nothing, but inside something had changed. The words "you'll never" no longer felt like a verdict. They felt like a challenge. And I wasn't going to answer it with arguments. I was going to answer it with walls, with windows, with a foundation so strong it didn't shake when someone laughed. I didn't know then how long it would take. I didn't know how much I would sacrifice. I didn't know that the day my mother finally stood in my doorway, silent and stunned, would rewrite everything between us. All I knew was that I was done trying to win a comparison I never agreed to. I was going to build something that belonged to me. And this time, I wouldn't tell them until it was finished. I didn't tell my parents about the land when I bought it. That sentence still makes me feel a quiet kind of rebellion. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. It wasn't much, just a narrow, overlooked lot on the edge of town, squeezed between an aging oak tree and a stretch of undeveloped field. The price was low because most buyers wanted something grander, something already impressive. This plot had uneven soil and no existing structure to brag about. But when I stepped onto it for the first time, I didn't see flaws. I saw possibility. I saw morning light stretching across open grass. I saw the outline of the house I had described to Daniel that night on my apartment floor. I ran my fingers through the dirt and felt something settle inside me. This would be mine. Daniel stood beside me, hands in his jacket pockets, scanning the space. "You're already designing it in your head, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded. Every inch. We didn't have a huge budget. There was no investor, no family contribution, just savings I had scraped together from years of overtime and freelance jobs, and Daniel's steady income from contracting work. We weren't reckless about it. We sat at my kitchen table night after night, calculators out, spreadsheets open, arguing gently about insulation costs and roofing materials. "We can't rush this," Daniel would remind me. "I know," I'd say, though everything in me wanted to see walls rising immediately. Meanwhile, Clara and Ethan announced they were adding a third bathroom and expanding their master suite. My mother called me breathless with excitement. "It's going to be enormous," she said. "You should see the walk-in closet." "That's nice," I replied, pressing my phone between my shoulder and ear while sketching beam placements. "You know," she added casually, "there's nothing wrong with renting. Not everyone is meant to own something like that." Not everyone. I stared at my blueprint and felt the old sting. But it didn't last as long as it used to, because this time I had something she didn't know about. Construction began 6 months later. The first day the foundation was poured, I stood there in boots and jeans, watching the concrete spread into the forms we had set. My hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of what it meant. A foundation is quiet work. No one admires it, no one takes glamorous photos of it, but everything rests on it. I thought about my life in that moment. All those years of not bad, all those comparisons, all the times I swallowed humiliation at dinner tables polished to a shine. This foundation was mine. No one could laugh it away. Daniel worked alongside his crew, but he never treated me like I didn't belong there. When I double-checked measurements, he nodded. When I adjusted a window height to catch better light, he trusted me. There were setbacks, of course there were. One shipment of materials arrived warped from water damage. We had to return it and wait weeks for replacements. Heavy rain delayed framing. At one point, I sat in my car and cried because the budget was tightening faster than expected. "Maybe your parents were right," a small, cruel voice inside me whispered one night. "Maybe you aimed too high." But Daniel found me on the porch of the half-framed structure, staring at the skeleton of my dream. "Talk to me," he said gently. "I'm scared," I admitted. "What if this ends up being average? What if after all this, it's nothing special?" He looked around at the beams reaching toward the sky. Special to who? The question lingered. Special to my parents? To Clara? To neighbors who drove by? Or special to me? As the walls went up, I visited the site every evening after work. I would walk through what would become the kitchen and imagine the smell of coffee. I'd stand where the living room window would frame the oak tree and picture golden afternoon light pooling on hardwood floors. This house wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to breathe. Wide windows for natural light, open shelves for books, a small reading nook built into the wall, a modest garden space behind it. No marble, no unnecessary grandeur, just intention. I kept it secret for almost a year. It wasn't easy. Family dinners were still full of updates about Clara's property value rising. Ethan had flipped 2 smaller houses for profit. My father practically glowed when he talked about it. Real estate is the smartest investment. You have to think big. I would nod and sip my water. One evening, Clara leaned across the table and said, "So, any big plans for you? Career taking off yet?" I smiled softly. "It's growing." She tilted her head. "You know, you could always ask Ethan for advice. He's really good with properties." The irony almost made me laugh, but I swallowed it. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. Inside, something was building alongside the house, a quiet confidence, not loud defiance, not revenge, just certainty. The day we installed the windows was the first time I truly felt it. Sunlight poured into the unfinished space, warming the raw wood and casting long, soft shadows. I stood in the center of the future living room and closed my eyes. It felt like home already. Daniel walked up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You did this," he whispered. We weren't married yet. There was no ring on my finger, but in that moment, partnership felt more solid than any legal document. We moved in before everything was perfect. The baseboards weren't fully painted, the garden was just freshly turned soil, but the structure was complete, safe, ours. The first morning I woke up there, light filtered through the wide bedroom windows exactly the way I'd imagined, soft, golden, gentle. I walked barefoot across the hardwood floor, ran my hand along the kitchen counter, simple quartz, not marble, and felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Peace. Not victory. Peace. We invited friends first, not my family. I wasn't ready yet. I wanted to live in it, to let the walls absorb laughter and quiet evenings before exposing it to comparison. Months passed. The garden began to grow. Herbs along one side, tomatoes climbing carefully placed supports. The oak tree in the front yard became my favorite feature. In autumn, its leaves scattered across the lawn like copper coins. Clara and Ethan, meanwhile, decided to host a summer party at their place. My parents insisted I attend. Their house was bigger than ever. Fresh landscaping, a new stone patio, guests complimented everything. I stood near the edge of the yard, listening to my father boast. Clara has always aimed high. She's always known how to choose the best. I felt the old ache, but it was distant now, like remembering a bruise that had already healed. At one point, my mother joined me by the drinks table. She glanced at my simple dress and then at Clara's designer outfit. "You're still in that little apartment?" she asked casually. I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said gently. She blinked. "Oh, you moved?" "Yes." "Where?" I smiled, not smug, not sharp, just calm. "I'll show you soon." Her expression shifted, curiosity flickering across her face. That night, driving back to my house, I felt the weight of years lifting. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was choosing my timing. I didn't want a dramatic reveal. I didn't want applause. I just wanted them to see it, to stand inside something built from every not bad, every comparison, every dismissive laugh. Because this house wasn't just wood and glass. It was resilience. It was quiet persistence. It was proof that success doesn't always sparkle. It sometimes glows softly, steadily from within. And soon, they were going to step inside it. The invitation wasn't dramatic. I didn't mail embossed cards or make a grand announcement at dinner. I simply called my mother one afternoon while I was trimming basil in the garden. "Daniel and I are hosting a small housewarming this Sunday," I said. "I'd love for you and Dad to come." There was a pause on the other end. "Housewarming?" she repeated. "You mean an apartment thing?" "No," I said softly. "A house." Silence. Not long, just enough. "Oh," she said finally. "Well, of course. Send me the address." When I hung up, my hands were steady. I thought they might shake. I thought I might feel nervous, but instead, I felt ready. Sunday arrived bright and clear. The oak tree cast gentle shade across the front yard. Daniel had insisted on mowing the lawn twice, even though it didn't need it. He said he wanted everything to look neat. I teased him for caring more about impressions than I did. "I don't care about impressions," he replied. "I care about you not being stressed." Friends arrived first. Warm hugs, laughter that filled the open living room and bounced softly off the high ceilings. Someone complimented the built-in shelves. Someone else asked who designed the layout. I answered simply, "I did." No one seemed surprised. They just nodded, impressed in a way that felt genuine, not comparative. Then just after 3 o'clock, my parents' car pulled into the driveway. I saw it through the wide front window, the same sedan they'd driven for years, reliable, predictable. My stomach tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of history. Daniel squeezed my hand. "You've got this." I opened the front door before they could knock. My mother stepped out first, wearing a pale blue blouse and her usual polite smile. My father followed, scanning the exterior like he was evaluating a property listing. They both paused at the base of the walkway. The house wasn't enormous, it didn't tower, but it stood confidently. Clean lines, large windows, warm wood accents around the entrance. The oak tree framed it perfectly, branches arching overhead like a natural canopy. "This is it?" my father asked. "Yes," I said. "Welcome." They walked slowly up the path. My mother ran her fingers lightly over the wooden trim by the door. "It's modern," she murmured. I stepped aside to let them in. And then it happened. They crossed the threshold and stopped. Not because of marble floors, not because of chandeliers, but because of light. The living room opened wide, sunlight pouring in from floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the backyard. The oak tree's leaves shimmered just beyond the glass. The hardwood floors glowed honey gold. The built-in shelves curved gently along one wall, filled with books and framed sketches. There was space, but not emptiness, warmth, but not clutter. My mother's mouth parted slightly. My father turned slowly in a circle, eyes lifting toward the subtle recessed lighting, then drifting toward the open kitchen with its quartz counters and handcrafted cabinets. "You designed this?" he asked. "Yes." Daniel stepped forward, offering a handshake. My father shook it, still looking around. My mother wandered toward the reading nook built into the wall, a small alcove with cushioned seating and soft lighting. She touched the fabric gently. "It feels," she searched for the word, "peaceful." I swallowed. That was the goal. Friends mingled around them, chatting easily. Someone mentioned how the house felt like a retreat. Another commented on the way the garden view blended seamlessly with the interior. My parents listened, quiet. Clara and Ethan arrived 20 minutes later. Clara stepped inside confidently, but her expression shifted almost immediately. She blinked once, taking in the open layout, the light, the intentional details. "Oh," she said. "Just that." Ethan nodded slowly. "Nice use of space," he admitted. "The window placement is smart." "Thank you," I replied calmly. Clara walked toward the backyard doors and slid one open. The scent of herbs drifted inside. She stepped out onto the modest wooden deck, glancing at the neat rows of plants. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Yes." She looked back at me, and for the first time in my life, there was no amusement in her eyes, no subtle condescension, just recalibration. My father eventually found himself standing beside me near the window. "How big is it?" he asked. "Smaller than Clara's," I said honestly, "but every inch is intentional." He nodded slowly. "It doesn't feel small." "No," I said, "it doesn't." We gave them a tour, the bedroom with soft morning light, the compact but efficient office space, the bathroom with simple, elegant fixtures, not flashy but thoughtfully placed. When we returned to the living room, my mother lingered near the entrance, glancing around one more time. "You know," she said slowly, "I didn't know." "About?" I asked. She hesitated. "That you were capable of this." The words weren't cruel, they were honest, and somehow that honesty hurt more than the jokes ever had. I took a slow breath. "I've always been capable," I said gently. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing not the quieter, awkward daughter in Clara's shadow, but a woman who had built something from scratch. Later, after most guests had left, my parents remained. The house was quieter, softer. Evening light replaced the afternoon glow. My father cleared his throat. "You proved us wrong," he said. I almost smiled at the phrasing, proved wrong, as if this had been a contest. "I didn't build this to prove anything. I built it because it's what I wanted." He nodded slowly. My mother stepped closer. "When we said those things," she began, voice unsteady, "we thought we were motivating you." I felt a flicker of old pain, but it didn't consume me. "It didn't feel like motivation," I said softly. She looked down at her hands. "I see that now." There it was. Not a dramatic apology, not tears, but acknowledgement. Clara approached us then, arms crossed lightly. "It suits you, this house," she said. "Thank you," I replied. She glanced around again. "It feels like someone who knows exactly who they are." That sentence settled deep inside me, because that was the real difference. Clara's house was impressive, large, valuable. Mine was intentional. As the evening wound down and my parents prepared to leave, my mother paused at the door. She looked back one last time at the living room bathed in soft amber light. "You know," she said slowly, I was wrong to laugh. I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence sit. I know, I said finally. She nodded once, eyes glistening slightly. Then she stepped outside. When the door closed, Daniel wrapped his arms around me from behind. "How do you feel?" he whispered. I scanned the room, the shelves, the windows, the quiet strength in every beam. "I feel," I said carefully, "like I was never behind. I was just building differently." And for the first time in my life, I understood something clearly. Their laughter had never defined my future. It had only revealed their limits, not mine. After my parents left that night, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something inside me had shifted. For years, every achievement of mine had carried an invisible asterisk. Not as good as Clara, not impressive enough, not big enough. But standing in my own living room after they'd finally seen it, I realized something that almost made me laugh. I had been chasing their approval without noticing that I had already outgrown the need for it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of wind through the oak tree outside. Daniel was still asleep. I slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen, letting my fingers glide across the counter. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, breathing in the warmth of it. I replayed my mother's words in my mind. I was wrong to laugh. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't tearful or dramatic, but it was real, and that mattered more. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. "Clara." I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said. Her voice sounded different, less polished. "Hi. I've been thinking about your place." "Okay." "It's beautiful," she said plainly. "Not just nice, beautiful." I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments from Clara had always been rare, usually wrapped in subtle comparison, but this felt stripped down, honest. "Thank you," I replied. There was a pause. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes," I said after a moment. "I am." Another silence, longer this time. "I'm glad," she said quietly. Then she hung up. I stood there holding the phone, unsettled. Clara had always seemed untouchable, confident, certain, but there had been something fragile in her voice just now. Over the next few weeks, my parents' tone changed, subtly. My mother began asking about the garden. My father asked about construction costs, not dismissively, but curiously. When they visited again, they stayed longer. They sat at my kitchen island and drank coffee without commenting on what was missing. But something else was happening too. Clara and Ethan's life, the one that had always seemed glossy and flawless, started to crack at the edges. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. Clara skipping family dinners, Ethan's name coming up less frequently in my mother's updates. Then one evening, my mother called me, voice tight. "Clara and Ethan are separating," she said. The words landed heavily. "What happened?" I asked gently. "I don't know all the details," she replied. "Something about financial stress, investments that didn't go the way they planned." Financial stress. The phrase felt almost ironic. Their house had always symbolized security, success, superiority. "Is Clara okay?" I asked. "She's embarrassed," my mother admitted. "She doesn't want anyone to know." I thought about the parties, the renovations, the boasting, the way my father had glowed when talking about property values. A week later, Clara showed up at my door, alone. She stood on the porch looking somehow smaller, not physically, but energetically. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her makeup minimal. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course." She stepped inside slowly, like she was entering a sacred space. She'd been here before, but this time felt different, quieter, more vulnerable. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured tea instead of coffee. It felt softer. "I'm moving out," she said, staring into her cup. "The house is going on the market." I nodded, giving her space. She continued, I thought we had everything figured out, the investments, the upgrades, the image, but we were stretched thinner than I realized. She gave a hollow laugh. Turns out granite countertops don't guarantee stability. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't need to. I always thought you were the brave one, she said suddenly. I blinked. Me? Yes, you did what you wanted. You built something that fit you. I I built something that impressed people. Her honesty pierced through years of rivalry. I didn't know how much pressure you felt, I admitted. She shrugged weakly. It was easier to play the role, the successful daughter, the one mom and dad could brag about. And you think I didn't feel pressure? I asked gently. She looked at me then, eyes softening. I know you did. I just didn't realize how unfair it was. We sat in silence for a while. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting warm light across the table. I used to laugh when they said you'd never have a house like mine, she confessed. Not because I believed it, but because I needed to believe I'd won something. The admission hurt, but it also healed. I never wanted to compete, I said quietly. I know that now. She looked around the room again. This place, it doesn't feel like it's trying to prove anything. It isn't, I replied. A tear slipped down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly. I don't know who I am without all of that, she whispered. And in that moment, I realized something profound. For years, I had envied Clara's spotlight, her praise, her pedestal. But pedestals are unstable. When you build your life around being admired, you become fragile when admiration fades. I reached across the table and took her hand. You're more than the house, I said. She nodded, gripping my fingers tightly. Over the following months, Clara moved into a small townhouse across town. Modest, practical, nothing like the sprawling property she once flaunted. My parents struggled with it at first. I could see the disappointment flicker across my father's face when he talked about downsizing. But something else was shifting in them too. They visited me more often, not to compare, not to evaluate, just to sit. My mother began bringing small plants for the garden. My father asked if he could help build a bench under the oak tree. One evening, as we were assembling it together, he said quietly, I think we pushed the wrong things. I kept my focus on tightening a bolt. What do you mean? He admitted we thought success had one shape, big, visible, impressive. He paused. But this feels different. Better? I asked softly. He nodded. Stronger. The bench stood firm beneath the oak tree when we finished. Solid, simple, functional. A lot like my house, and a lot like the version of myself I had become. Clara visited often too. She'd sit in the reading nook and talk about starting over, about figuring out what she actually liked instead of what looked impressive. One evening, she laughed softly and said, You know what's funny? I finally understand what you meant when you said every inch should be intentional. I smiled. It applies to more than houses. She nodded. Looking back now, I realized the story was never really about proving my parents wrong. It wasn't about building something bigger or better. It was about building something true. My parents' laughter once echoed loudly in my mind, but now when I think of that phrase, you'll never have a house like your sister, I don't feel anger, because they were right. I never had a house like hers. I had one like mine, and in the end, that made all the difference. After my parents left that night, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because something inside me had shifted. For years, every achievement of mine had carried an invisible asterisk. Not as good as Clara, not impressive enough, not big enough. But standing in my own living room after they'd finally seen it, I realized something that almost made me laugh. I had been chasing their approval without noticing that I had already outgrown the need for it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of wind through the oak tree outside. Daniel was still asleep. I slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen, letting my fingers glide across the counter. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, breathing in the warmth of it. I replayed my mother's words in my mind. I was wrong to laugh. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't tearful or dramatic, but it was real, and that mattered more. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. Clara. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hey, she said. Her voice sounded different, less polished. Hi. I've been thinking about your place. Okay. It's beautiful, she said plainly. Not just nice, beautiful. I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments from Clara had always been rare, usually wrapped in subtle comparison, but this felt stripped down, honest. Thank you, I replied. There was a pause. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said after a moment. I am. Another silence, longer this time. I'm glad, she said quietly. Then she hung up. I stood there holding the phone, unsettled. Clara had always seemed untouchable, confident, certain, but there had been something fragile in her voice just now. Over the next few weeks, my parents' tone changed subtly. My mother began asking about the garden. My father asked about construction costs, not dismissively, but curiously. If the story ended there, it would be neat, clean, a quiet triumph, a humbled family, a lesson learned. But real families don't transform overnight. Old habits don't dissolve just because one Sunday afternoon shifted the air. A few months after Clara moved into her townhouse, my parents invited both of us to dinner. Not at Clara's old grand dining table, not at a restaurant. At their house, the same modest home we grew up in, with its slightly creaky floors and floral wallpaper my mother had refused to replace for 20 years. I hadn't sat at that table without feeling compared, and I couldn't even remember how long. Daniel squeezed my hand before we went in. Whatever happens, he murmured, you don't have anything to prove. I nodded, and for once I believed it fully. Dinner started awkwardly. My mother overcooked the chicken because she was distracted. My father talked about the weather. Clara picked at her food quietly. Then, halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. I've been thinking, he began. That phrase used to signal criticism. Tonight it sounded heavier. About how we raised you girls. Clara stiffened slightly. I stayed still. We always told ourselves we were pushing you to succeed, he continued, but I'm starting to realize we may have confused success with status. My mother set her fork down. We were proud of Clara's house, she said carefully. It felt like proof that we had done something right. And what was I asked softly. She looked at me, eyes glossy. We didn't know how to measure you. The words landed strangely, not insulting, not complimentary, just revealing. You didn't fit the image we had in our heads, my father added, and instead of adjusting the image, we tried to adjust you. I felt Daniel's knee press gently against mine under the table, grounding. For years, my mother continued, voice trembling, we laughed about that house comment. I thought it was harmless teasing. I didn't understand how it chipped away at you. It did, I admitted, not angrily, just truthfully. Clara swallowed. I made it worse, she said quietly. I played along. You were playing a role too, I replied. She looked relieved that I didn't accuse her. My father leaned back in his chair. When your sister lost that house, he said, glancing at Clara, I felt ashamed, not of her, of myself, because I realized how much I had attached my pride to square footage. A bitter laugh escaped Clara. You weren't the only one. Silence settled around the table, but it wasn't heavy like it used to be. It felt honest. I don't need you to regret the past, I said carefully. I just need you to see me. My mother's lips trembled. We do now. The words weren't perfect. They didn't erase years of comparison, but they felt real. After dinner, my father asked if he could see photos of the garden's progress. My mother asked for the herb bread recipe I'd served at the housewarming. Clara lingered after our parents went to bed. I'm thinking about going back to school, she said, sitting at the kitchen counter. Not business, something different. What? I asked. Interior design. She gave a small, shy smile. I've always loved creating spaces. I just never admitted it because Ethan was the real estate genius. I felt something warm bloom in my chest. You'd be good at that, I said honestly. She nodded. Maybe you could help me. For the first time in my life, she wasn't ahead of me or above me. She was beside me. Over the next year, our dynamics shifted slowly. My parents still slipped up sometimes. Old patterns are stubborn, but the sharp edge of comparison dulled. One afternoon, my mother visited alone. We sat in the backyard under the oak tree, the bench my father had built, solid beneath us. The garden was thriving now, lavender, rosemary, tomatoes heavy on their vines. I used to think a big house meant safety, she said quietly, that if you had enough space, enough money, enough admiration, nothing could go wrong. I smiled gently. Nothing works like that. She nodded. My father and I worried about you because you chose a harder path. It wasn't flashy. It didn't guarantee fast results. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I know that now. She reached for my hand. I'm proud of you, not for the house. I waited. For knowing yourself. Those 4 words settled deeper than any praise about property ever could. Meanwhile, Clara enrolled in classes. She'd come over with fabric samples and mood boards, spreading them across my kitchen island. We'd talk for hours about color palettes and spatial flow. There was no competition in those conversations, just collaboration. One evening, as we stood side by side adjusting a lighting fixture she'd picked for her townhouse, she said, "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if Mom and Dad didn't compare us?" All the time, I admitted. Do you resent me? She asked softly. I considered the question honestly. I used to, I said, but I realize now you were carrying their expectations just as heavily as I was. She exhaled, relief washing over her face. I don't want us to be rivals anymore, she said. We don't have to be. As seasons changed, so did our family rhythm. Holidays felt less performative. Conversations felt less like scorekeeping. And then one winter evening, something happened that made everything come full circle. My parents hosted a small gathering for extended relatives, nothing extravagant, just warm food and conversation. At one point, an aunt asked casually, "So which daughter has the bigger house these days?" The old version of my father might have answered proudly, listing square footage and renovations. But this time he smiled calmly and said, "That's not really the point anymore." The table went quiet. Our daughters built lives that fit them, he continued, and that's what matters. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Clara caught my eye across the room and gave a small nod. Later, as Daniel and I drove home, snow beginning to dust the roads lightly, he reached over and squeezed my hand. You changed something, he said. I didn't mean to. Doesn't matter, you did. When we pulled into our driveway, the house glowed warmly against the dark sky. The oak tree's branches were bare now, but steady. I stepped inside and paused in the living room. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just quiet strength in every wall. For years, I had internalized that sentence, "You'll never have a house like your sister," as a verdict on my worth. But now I understand something simple and powerful. Comparison is a narrow lens. It shrinks people into measurements they were never meant to fit.
I didn't build this house to be bigger, I built it to be honest. And in doing so, I didn't just change my address, I changed the story my family told about success. Because in the end, it was never about granite countertops or square footage. It was about learning that fulfillment isn't loud. It doesn't need to impress. It simply needs to feel like home.
There's something people don't tell you about breaking family patterns. It doesn't end with one revelation. It echoes. It tests you. It asks whether you truly believe the lesson you fought so hard to learn. About a year after that winter gathering, Daniel proposed. Not in a restaurant, not under fireworks, just here, at home. He waited until late afternoon when the sun poured gold through the living room windows. I was kneeling by the fireplace, rearranging framed sketches of early drafts of the house. He walked up behind me and said, "You built a life you're proud of. I'd like to be part of it forever." When I turned around, he was holding a small velvet box. No extravagance, just intention. I said yes before he could finish asking. Planning the wedding brought up old currents I didn't expect. My mother immediately began suggesting venues, large ones, elegant ones, places that photographed well. "You deserve something impressive," she insisted over coffee one morning. I stirred sugar into my cup slowly. "I don't want impressive." She frowned slightly. "It's your wedding." "Exactly." She studied me as if recalibrating again. "What do you want?" I glanced around the kitchen, at the light streaming in, at the oak tree visible through the window. "I want it here." Her eyebrows lifted. "In your house?" "In the backyard." She looked startled at first, then thoughtful. "It won't look small," she said carefully. I smiled. "It will look like us." There was a time when I might have bent under that subtle pressure, a time when the idea of guests whispering about the size of the yard would have made my stomach knot. But now the thought barely stirred me. Clara was the first to support the idea. "It'll be beautiful," she said, already sketching layout ideas. "Intimate doesn't mean lesser." She had grown so much in that year. Her townhouse had transformed under her creative hand. Soft colors, thoughtful details, warmth that mirrored her evolving confidence. She had taken a few freelance interior design projects and found joy in them, not because they paid the most, but because they felt authentic. Watching her step into her own identity made something inside me soften toward our shared past. Wedding preparations brought our family together in a different way. My father helped Daniel reinforce part of the deck to ensure it could hold extra guests. My mother spent afternoons helping me choose flowers from local growers instead of expensive imports. One evening, as we strung lights between the oak tree branches, my father paused and looked around. "You know," he said, voice reflective, "if someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be building a wedding setup in this backyard instead of booking a ballroom, I would have thought we'd failed somehow." "And now?" I asked. He gave a small smile. "Now I think we were confused about what success looks like." The wedding day arrived warm and breezy. No chandeliers, no marble floors, just sunlight filtering through leaves, white chairs arranged neatly across the grass, and a simple wooden arch Daniel and I built together. As I walked down the short aisle, I didn't think about who had the bigger house. I didn't think about whether the event looked luxurious enough. I thought about how every detail felt chosen, not borrowed. When Daniel and I exchanged vows, I saw my parents in the front row. My mother was crying openly. My father's eyes were glossy. Clara stood beside them, smiling with quiet pride. Later, during the reception, one of my distant cousins leaned over and whispered, "It's not grand, but it's perfect." I smiled. That's the point. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Married life didn't change the house, it deepened it. More laughter echoed through the rooms, more shared meals filled the kitchen with warmth. A few months later, Clara landed her first major design contract. It wasn't for a mansion, it was for a small boutique cafe downtown. She poured her heart into it, choosing textures, lighting, seating layouts. When it opened, she invited all of us. The cafe wasn't huge, but it was beautiful. Soft earth tones, cozy corners, intentional lighting that made people linger. A customer complimented the space while we were there. "It feels like home," they said. Clara's eyes met mine across the room. We both smiled. That phrase again, home. Not size, not price, feeling. One evening, months later, my mother visited alone again. She stood in the living room watching the late summer light filter in. "You know what I realized?" she said softly. "What?" "I was afraid. When you chose a different path than Clara, I thought it meant you'd struggle. I thought if you didn't chase what looked secure, you'd fall behind." "I did struggle," I said gently. She nodded. "But you didn't fall behind. You built something stronger than what I understood." I sat beside her on the couch. "I don't blame you for wanting security." "I confused security with appearance," she replied. There it was again, the core lesson unfolding layer by layer. Months turned into years. Our family gatherings felt lighter now. The comparisons faded into old stories we rarely revisited. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Clara announced she was engaged, not to a developer, not to someone flashy, to a teacher named Marcus who loved books and quiet mornings. They didn't buy a large house. They rented a cozy one while saving carefully. At dinner one night, my aunt asked her, "Don't you miss the big place?" Clara glanced at me briefly before answering. "No," she said calmly, "I prefer something that fits." I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly, because years ago those words would have been unthinkable in our family. After everyone left that night, I stepped outside under the oak tree. The bench creaked softly as I sat. The house behind me glowed warmly. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one standing in corners at Thanksgiving, listening to laughter disguised as motivation, the one who believed she would always be measured and found lacking. I wish I could go back and whisper something to her. I would tell her this: they are not laughing at your future. They are revealing their own limits. You do not need to build bigger to be worthy. You only need to build true. And one day they will stand in the life you created and understand. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not all at once, but they will understand. As I sat there, Daniel joined me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "Thinking?" he asked. "Remembering," I said. He looked at the house, then at me. "You changed the definition." "Of what?" "Of what it means to succeed." I leaned into him, watching the windows reflect the moonlight. For years, I thought the goal was to have a house like my sister's, but now I know the goal was never to match someone else's blueprint. It was to write my own, and that is something no one can laugh away. Time has a quiet way of testing whether growth is real or just a momentary shift. It asks you, gently but firmly, have you truly changed, or are you waiting for the next comparison to pull you back? 2 years into our marriage, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen island, the same island that once felt like proof of something, and stared at a small white envelope between us. 2 pink lines. I hadn't expected the rush of emotion, not joy alone, not fear alone, something deeper, a sudden awareness that whatever patterns existed in my family, I now had the power to repeat them or break them completely. Daniel reached across the counter and placed his hand over mine. "We're going to do this differently," he said, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded slowly. "We have to." When we told my parents, my mother cried immediately. My father looked stunned, then proud. Clara wrapped me in a tight hug and whispered, "You're going to be an amazing mother." Her words echoed in my chest long after she pulled away. Amazing, not impressive, not successful, just amazing. Pregnancy softened something in me. It also sharpened my awareness. Every comment, every joke, every subtle comparison felt amplified because I knew little ears would one day absorb those tones. At a family dinner during my 3rd trimester, my aunt laughed and said, "I bet Clara will have the first grandbaby, though. She always wins the race." The old version of me might have stayed quiet, but I set down my fork gently and said, "There's no race." The table stilled. Clara smiled slightly. Exactly. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Because change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to participate in old narratives. Our daughter, Lily, was born on a rainy morning in early spring. The hospital room was dim and quiet when I first held her. She was tiny, warm, and impossibly fragile. As I looked down at her, I made a silent promise. You will never feel compared in your own home. When we brought Lily back to the house, sunlight broke through the clouds and poured through the wide living room windows. The oak tree swayed gently, as if welcoming her. I walked through each room holding her, noticing how the house felt even more intentional now, not just built for us, but for what we were becoming. My mother visited often in those early weeks. She'd rock Lily in the reading nook, humming softly. One afternoon, she looked up at me and said, "I worry sometimes." "About what?" I asked. "That I did things wrong with you girls." I sat beside her. "You did what you thought was right." "But thinking you're right doesn't mean you are," she whispered. Her honesty no longer startled me. It humbled me. I can't change the past, but I can be different now. And she was. When Clara later announced she was pregnant too, only months after Lily's first birthday, something shifted again in our family dynamic. 2 babies, 2 sisters raising daughters. At the first gathering after Clara shared the news, someone joked, "Let's see which one walks first." Without hesitation, my father spoke up. "They'll each walk when they're ready." I looked at him surprised. He met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. There it was again. Growth. Clara's daughter, Ava, was born in winter. She was calm where Lily was spirited, observant where Lily was loud. The first time the girls sat side by side on the living room rug chewing on the same toy block, I felt a fierce protectiveness. No comparisons. Not here. Not ever. As they grew into toddlers, differences naturally emerged. Lily spoke early. Ava preferred watching quietly before joining in. At a birthday party, another relative commented, "Lily's the bold one. Ava's more reserved, just like their mothers, I guess." The implication hovered there, unspoken but familiar. Clara caught it too. "She's thoughtful," Clara corrected gently, smiling at her daughter, "and that's powerful." I added, "And Lily's curious. That's powerful too." We didn't attack the comment, we reframed it. Later that evening, Clara and I sat on the bench under the oak tree while the girls napped inside. "Do you ever think about how easily we could repeat it?" she asked. "All the time," I admitted. She sighed. "I don't want Ava growing up thinking she has to be anything other than herself." "Then we make sure she doesn't," I said. She looked at the house behind us. "It started here, you know." "What did?" "The shift." I followed her gaze. The windows glowed softly in the late afternoon sun. "This house forced all of us to rethink what we valued," she continued. "You didn't fight us. You didn't compete louder. You just built differently." Her words wrapped around me like warmth. Years earlier, I believed building this house was about reclaiming dignity, about silencing laughter. But now I see it did something bigger. It gave our family a new blueprint. As Lily and Ava grew older, their personalities unfolded beautifully. Lily loved climbing the oak tree's lower branches. Ava preferred sitting beneath it with picture books. Neither was better, neither was behind. One afternoon, when they were about 5 and 4, respectively, Lily ran inside crying because Ava had finished a puzzle faster than she had. "I'm not as good," she wailed. My chest tightened. I knelt down and held her face gently and said, "You're not racing, you're learning." Ava stood nearby, uncertain. "You're both learning," I added, pulling them into a hug. "At your own pace." Clara watched from the doorway, eyes misty.
After the girls calmed down, she turned to me and whispered, "We're doing it." Doing what? Breaking it. Breaking the pattern. Later that night, after everyone left and the house fell quiet, I walked through the living room again. The shelves now held children's drawings beside architectural sketches. The garden outside had grown wilder, fuller, richer with time. I thought about that Thanksgiving years ago when my parents had laughed and said I'd never have a house like my sister's. They were right in ways they never intended. I didn't build a monument to impress. I built a foundation to heal. And that foundation now held more than walls and windows. It held new conversations, new awareness, new gentleness. Daniel joined me by the window, slipping his arm around my waist. "You're thinking again," he murmured. "Always." He glanced at Lily's toys scattered across the rug. "Worth it?" he asked. I looked around at the life unfolding inside these walls, the laughter, the vulnerability, the growth that continued quietly year after year. "Every beam," I said. Because in the end, the house was never about proving my parents wrong. It was about giving the next generation something we didn't have. A home without a scoreboard. A home without laughter that cuts. A home where success isn't measured in comparison, but in courage to be exactly who you are. And that is the kind of legacy no one can outgrow.
There's a strange thing that happens when peace becomes normal. You start to forget how loud the old chaos used to be. You begin to breathe without realizing you were once holding your breath. Lily turned 7 the same week Ava turned 6. We hosted a joint birthday party in the backyard, streamers tied carefully to the oak tree branches, a long wooden table set with mismatched plates and homemade cupcakes. Clara stood beside me as we arranged the final decorations. "Remember when everything felt like a competition?" she asked quietly. I laughed softly. "I try not to." She nodded. "Me too." The girls ran across the grass, giggling, inventing a game that made sense only to them. There was no race, no comparison, just childhood unfolding the way it should. But growth doesn't mean life stops testing you. That autumn, my father's health began to decline. It started small, fatigue, shortness of breath, things he brushed off as aging. Then came the diagnosis, a heart condition that required surgery. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room, the same kind of sterile space where Lily had been born years earlier, and feeling that old familiar vulnerability. My parents suddenly looked smaller, human, not towering figures of judgment or pride, just two people who had done their best and gotten some of it wrong. Clara sat beside me, silent. For once, there was no tension between us, only shared fear. When the surgery ended and the doctor told us it had gone well, I felt tears spill down my cheeks before I could stop them. Later, when we were allowed to see him, my father looked fragile in a way I had never seen before. Tubes, monitors, the steady beep of machines measuring life. He motioned for me to lean closer. "I've been thinking," he whispered, voice raspy. That phrase again. "About what?" I asked gently. "All those years," he said slowly. "I thought I was preparing you for the world, teaching you to aim higher." I squeezed his hand carefully. "But you didn't need pushing. You needed trusting." The words hit deeper than anything he'd ever said. "I'm proud of the house," he murmured, "not because it's beautiful, but because it's yours." I blinked back tears. "Thank you." He closed his eyes briefly. "I wish I'd understood sooner." I wanted to tell him it was okay, that we all grow in different seasons, but instead I just stood there holding his hand, letting the quiet say what words couldn't. Recovery was slow. During those months, Clara and I rotated visits to help my mother. I noticed something subtle but powerful. Our parents no longer spoke of success in terms of size or status. They spoke of time, about relationships, about meaning. One evening, after a long day of doctor's appointments, my mother sat at my kitchen table and stared out the window. "Your father said something today," she told me. "What?" "He said he used to measure life by what he could show people. Now he measures it by who shows up." I felt that settle inside me. Who shows up? When my father was strong enough to visit again, he insisted on sitting under the oak tree. The bench creaked softly beneath him. Lily climbed into his lap carefully, Ava sitting at his feet with a book. He watched them quietly for a long time. "I almost missed this," he said softly. "Missed what?" I asked. "This version of us." I understood what he meant. If Clara's house had remained the center of our family's pride, maybe we would have continued orbiting around appearances. Maybe we would have kept chasing something visible and impressive instead of something steady and sincere. But life interrupted that path, and my house, this simple, intentional place, became the gathering point instead. Months later, after my father fully recovered, he asked to speak at Lily's school career day. I didn't know what to expect. He stood in front of a classroom of small children and said, "When I was younger, I thought success meant having the biggest things, the biggest house, the biggest achievements, but I learned something from my daughter." He glanced at me, eyes warm. "She taught me that success is building something that fits your heart." I swallowed hard as Lily beamed proudly from her seat. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood in the living room again, the place that had once been proof, then healing, now legacy. Daniel joined me as he always did when I fell into reflection. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking about how one sentence changed everything." "Which one?" "You'll never have a house like your sister." He smiled faintly. They were right. I laughed softly. Yes, they were. Because if I chased Clara's blueprint, I would have built something that didn't belong to me. I would have continued the cycle. Instead, I chose something smaller in scale, but larger in impact. A home that shifted a family's definition of worth. A space where two little girls now grow up without scorecards. A place where my parents learned humility without losing dignity. One winter evening, years later, as snow dusted the roof lightly, Clara and I sat inside while the girls played upstairs. "Do you ever think about how fragile it all was?" she asked. "All the time," I admitted. "One comment," she said, "one choice, one decision to build differently." I nodded. "Thank you," she added quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For not trying to beat me, for just being you." I reached for her hand. We were both trying to survive in our own ways. She smiled. "Now we're just living." The oak tree outside stood bare against the winter sky, but I knew spring would come again. It always did. And with it, new growth. Looking back now, I realized the laughter that once hurt me so deeply wasn't the villain of the story. It was the spark, the moment that forced me to ask, what do I really want? And in answering that question honestly, I didn't just build a house, I built a different future. Not louder, not larger, but truer. And that truth echoes through every room, every season, every generation that will one day pass through these doors. When my parents came to see the house for the first time, I almost canceled. I stood in the kitchen that morning staring at the sunlight spilling across the marble island, and I felt that old, familiar tremor in my chest. Not fear of them exactly, just the weight of history. For years, every major moment of my life had come with their commentary, their comparison, their doubt. "You'll never catch up to your sister. You're not built for big things. You're too sensitive for the real world." And the one that had echoed the loudest, "You'll never have a house like your sister." I thought of all that as I wiped an already spotless counter for the third time. Daniel walked in, took the cloth from my hand, and kissed my forehead. "They're just coming to see their daughter's home," he said softly. I gave him a small smile. "You don't know my parents." He didn't argue, he just squeezed my hand. When their car finally pulled into the driveway, my stomach dropped. I watched from the living room window as my mother stepped out first, adjusting her sunglasses, scanning the property with a quick, assessing glance. My father followed more slowly, his eyes moving upward toward the roofline, then the windows. They didn't look impressed. They looked confused. Daniel opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Welcome," he said warmly. My mother walked in first, and the moment she crossed the threshold, her expression changed. It was subtle, but I saw it. The ceilings were higher than she expected, the natural light softer, the space intentional. Her eyes moved across the living room, the open layout, the custom shelves Daniel had built himself. She turned slowly in a circle as if recalibrating. "Oh," she said. Just that. "Oh." My father cleared his throat. "This is bigger than it looked outside." I swallowed. "Would you like a tour?" I asked. They followed me room by room, and with each step, their silence grew heavier. The guest suite, the office, the sunroom overlooking the small garden we had planted ourselves. When we reached the kitchen again, my mother ran her hand along the countertop. "Is this real stone?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "We chose it together." She nodded, then glanced at my father. He looked at me for a long moment. "You did all this?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried years inside it. "Yes," I said quietly, "we did." He exhaled slowly, almost as if something inside him had shifted. Then my mother said it. "Well," she began, and I braced myself. "It's not quite like your sister's place, of course." There it was, the comparison, the reflex. But this time, it didn't pierce me, because this time it wasn't true. My sister's house was larger, yes, it had a more expensive address, but it had also come with an enormous mortgage and a husband who rarely came home before midnight. It had come with arguments I had overheard during family dinners, whispers behind closed doors, stress lines my sister tried to hide under makeup. My home was different, and I finally understood that different did not mean less. I met my mother's gaze calmly. "You're right," I said. "It's not like hers." She looked almost satisfied for a second. Then I continued. "It's ours, and it's exactly what we wanted." The room went quiet. Daniel's hand found the small of my back. My father looked between us, then around the kitchen again, and for the first time in my life, he said something I had never heard before. "I'm proud of you." The words were awkward, as if they didn't fit comfortably in his mouth, but they were real. I blinked hard, because I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had still wanted to hear that. My mother didn't say anything, but her expression softened slightly. We sat down for lunch at the dining table Daniel had refinished himself. The conversation was careful at first, safe topics, weather, work, the drive over. Then my father asked, "How did you manage this, truly?" There was no sarcasm in his voice, just curiosity. So I told him. I told him about the nights Daniel and I stayed up budgeting, about the months we skipped vacations, about the way we learned new skills instead of paying for every service, about the years of saving quietly while everyone assumed we were falling behind. I told him how many times I doubted myself, how many times I almost believed their words. My mother listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "I didn't realize that you were working towards something like this," she said slowly. I almost laughed. Of course you didn't, I thought, because you never asked. But instead, I just said, I didn't need anyone to see it while it was being built. That line hung in the air. After lunch, my mother wandered into the backyard alone. I followed her. She stood near the small tree Daniel and I planted the day we signed the final papers. "It's peaceful here," she said. "Yes," I replied. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that stunned me. "I may have pushed you too hard." The admission was soft, not dramatic, not tearful, just honest. "I thought comparing you to your sister would motivate you. I thought it would make you stronger."
It made me feel small, I said gently. She nodded, staring at the tree. I see that now. We stood there together, not quite healed, but closer than we had ever been. When they left later that afternoon, my father hugged me tightly. My mother held on a second longer than usual. And as their car disappeared down the street, I didn't feel anger. I felt closure. That evening, my sister called. I heard Mom and Dad saw your house, she said. They did. There was a pause. Mom said it's beautiful. I smiled faintly. She also said it's very you. I laughed softly. That's the best compliment I could ask for. Then my sister's voice dropped. I'm happy for you, really. And for the first time, I believed her. Because maybe she had been trapped in the comparison too. Maybe we both had. After I hung up, I walked through the house slowly. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway lined with photos of Daniel and I over the years. I realized something profound. This house wasn't proof that I was better than my sister. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a trophy. It was proof that I'd stopped trying to measure my life by someone else's ruler. And that realization felt bigger than any square footage. That night, Daniel and I sat on the back steps under the quiet sky. Do you feel different? He asked. Yes, I said, but not because of them. He raised an eyebrow. Because of me, I explained, because I finally believe I'm enough, even if this house disappeared tomorrow. He smiled and kissed my temple. You were always enough, he said. I leaned my head against his shoulder and let that truth settle in. For so long, I thought success meant silencing the laughter, proving them wrong, winning the comparison. But real success was building something that felt like home inside myself first. The house was just a reflection of that. And as I looked back at the warm lights glowing through our windows, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't that my parents had finally seen my worth. It was that I'd stopped needing them to.
In the weeks after my parents visited, something inside me settled in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no triumphant music playing in the background of my life. It was quieter than that. Like the feeling after a long storm when the sky clears and you suddenly realize you can breathe without bracing yourself. For years, I had lived with this invisible scoreboard in my mind. Every achievement, every purchase, every decision was measured against my sister's. If she got a promotion, I wondered why I hadn't. If she bought something new, I questioned whether I was behind. If my parents praised her, I silently adjusted my expectations of myself downward. I told myself I didn't care, but I did. The day my parents laughed and said, "You'll never have a house like your sister," I carried that sentence like a prophecy, not because I believed I was incapable, but because I believed they were right about how the world saw me, the quiet one, the sensitive one, the one who would always come second. What I didn't understand back then was that second place only exists in a race, and I had been running a race I never signed up for. One evening, about a month after their visit, my sister came over alone. She hadn't seen the house yet, not really. When our parents came, she had been too busy, which I knew meant something else entirely. She walked in slowly, her heels clicking against the floor, her eyes scanning the room the same way our mothers had. But there was no calculation in her gaze, just curiosity. "It feels calm," she said after a moment. "It is," I replied. She set her purse down and wandered toward the windows overlooking the garden. The sun was setting, casting everything in gold. "You did this?" she asked. "We did," I corrected gently. She nodded. "I always forget you're good at finishing things." I smiled faintly. That's because nobody paid attention when I did. She didn't argue. Instead, she sighed and sank on the couch. "I'm tired," she admitted. The vulnerability in her voice startled me. My sister had always been the polished one, the achiever, the one with the impressive job and the impressive address and the impressive everything. "Of what?" I asked carefully. "Of keeping up," she said. That word hit me harder than any insult ever had. Keeping up. So it's not just me, I murmured. She gave a small, humorless laugh. You think I haven't felt compared too? Mom and Dad don't just compare you to me. They compare me to some imaginary version of myself that's always supposed to be doing more. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Bigger house, better car, more status, perfect marriage. I feel like I'm performing all the time. I sat across from her, absorbing the weight of that confession. All these years I had thought she was winning, but maybe she had just been running faster. Are you happy? I asked softly. Her eyes opened, and for a second I saw something raw there. I don't know, she said honestly. We sat in silence. Then she looked around again. You look happy, she added. And that was when I realized the true shift. I wasn't glowing because my parents had been impressed. I wasn't lighter because I had finally beaten some invisible standard. I was lighter because I had stopped chasing it. I am, I said, but not because of the house. She tilted her head. Then why? Because this is the first thing I built without trying to prove something. The words surprised even me. My sister swallowed slowly. I don't know how to do that. I walked over and sat beside her. It starts with asking what you want, not what looks good, not what sounds impressive, just what feels right. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment. I don't even know what that is anymore, she whispered. And suddenly the competition between us felt small, trivial, almost tragic. Because neither of us had been trying to hurt the other, we had both just been trying to survive expectations that were too heavy. Before she left that night, she hugged me tightly. I'm proud of you, she said. And this time it wasn't about square footage or finishes or appearances. It was about courage. Months passed, seasons shifted. The small tree in our backyard grew stronger roots, and so did I. My relationship with my parents changed too, not overnight, not perfectly, but gradually. They stopped comparing as often, or maybe I just stopped listening for it. When my mother made an offhand remark about someone else's bigger kitchen at a family gathering, I didn't shrink. I smiled and said, I love mine. And I meant it. When my father talked about investments and property values, I nodded politely but didn't feel the need to justify our choices. The difference wasn't in them, it was in me. One afternoon, my mother came by unexpectedly. She stood in the kitchen watching me make tea. You seem different, she said. How? More settled. I poured the tea slowly. I stopped trying to be who you thought I should be. The honesty could have sparked defensiveness, but it didn't. Instead, she sat down and looked at her hands. I didn't realize how much pressure we put on you, she said quietly. I thought pushing you would protect you. From what? I asked. From mediocrity, she admitted. I couldn't help but smile gently. There's nothing mediocre about peace. She looked around the room again this time, not as a critic, but as a mother observing her daughter's life. I see that now, she said, and maybe that was enough. Years from now, I know this house will just be walls and windows and memories. It may not be the most expensive property on the street. It may not impress strangers. It may not even be our forever home. But it will always represent the moment I chose myself, the moment I stopped letting laughter define my limits, the moment I realized that success isn't about having a house like your sister. It's about building a life that feels like home when you close the door. If you're listening to my story and you've ever been compared, measured, told you'd never quite reach someone else's standard, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind, you are not less, and you are not required to live someone else's dream just to prove your worth. The people who laugh at your potential often are projecting their own fears, and sometimes the greatest revenge isn't building something bigger. It's building something truer. When I stand in my kitchen now, sunlight warming the counters, I don't hear my parents' old words anymore. I hear my own. This is enough. I am enough, and that is a home no one can take away.